Traffic. Yeah. Thank you. Welcome to our special council meeting of the Beaumont City Council on Monday, July 17th, 2023 at 5 p.m. I see Sam is coming in a moment here. We will have full attendance in a moment. And we begin all meetings with our land acknowledgement, which I'll do at this time. The city of Beaumont respects the histories, languages, and cultures of all First Peoples of this land, whether it be a First Nation, Métis, or Inuit descent, and appreciates that their presence continues to enrich vibrant communities across the land. As we gather here in Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation, we acknowledge that we are all treaty people and have ongoing responsibilities to protect and honor the treaty, the inherent rights of the people and the land. Next on our agenda is the adoption of the agenda. Madam Clerk, are there any changes to our agenda this evening?
Thank you, Mayor. There's no additions or changes to the agenda this evening.
Thank you. Is there a member of council willing to move the adoption of the agenda? What you see it on the screen here? Council Miller, Ashley, you have the floor.
Sure, I'll move that the July 17th, 2023 council agenda be adopted as presented.
Thank you, Councillor. Discussion on the motion. I'm seeing none. Council, would you please vote on the motion on the screen? And that carries unanimously 5-0. It would, Councilor Marcos is not quite with us yet, so we will continue with our meeting. Next on the agenda is our business items, which is first of all, 3.1 financial sustainability. Mr. Dowler, I believe you'll be presenting along with Mr. DeBlanco and Ms. Bozo Huzak. I believe will be presenting at some point. So Mr. Dowler, to leave your our first up.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, members of council. Administration is here this evening to provide a presentation on the concept of financial sustainability. Presentation will touch on what financial sustainability actually is, comment on where the city of Beaumont currently is, identify some specific areas of focus, and then delve into a little deeper into a couple of key aspects, namely asset management and priority-based budgeting. To start though, we'll touch on what makes financial sustainability relevant for council and citizens of Beaumont. At a very basic level, financial sustainability is intended to provide an indication on the ability of the city of Beaumont to maintain existing services and programs without raising taxes or increasing debt. Although focused on the current state, having an understanding of sustainability allows for better informed strategic investments in the short term that then support positive long-term fiscal health and investments. All of this is intended to support and inform decisions that will assist in achieving council's strategic plan and the required investments to support the growth of the city. Understanding our financial sustainability allows us all to have a solid foundation as key decisions are required to deal with the existing assets and services at the same time as we need to address the growth of the city. All as we endeavor to limit the financial impact on the citizens and ratepayers in Beaumont. When we get into the slides, you'll see one that shows a view of how a variety of the elements associated with financial sustainability interact with each other. All of these pieces influence and impact each other and include key areas such as revenue generation, expenditure management, long-term financial planning, collaboration and partnerships, and community engagement. Administration has done and will continue to do work in each of these elements. All of that being said, there is still opportunity to improve and enhance our understanding of financial sustainability. As we exist today, it would be difficult for administration to state that the city of Beaumont is financially sustainable. This being the case, and knowing Beaumont is facing the combined pressure of looking after our current services and infrastructure, as well as dealing with exceptional growth, administration is focusing on a few things, such as the evolution of an off-site levy model, a utility rate model, enhancing our procurement practices, developing reserve plans, evolving our asset management, and incorporating priority-based budgeting. With that as the introduction, I will now hand the presentation over to Ms. Boso Hudak, who will take a closer examination of asset management.
Thanks, Mike. Good evening, Mayor, Council, and the public. My name is Jennifer Boso Hudak, and I'm the Director of Corporate Analytics and Technology for the city. I'm going to spend a bit of time on those two green spokes about asset management as it relates to financial sustainability in Beaumont. So let's just begin and start reviewing the definition in our current council policy C16. Asset management is the process of making decisions about the use and care of infrastructure to deliver services in a way that considers current and future needs, manages risks and opportunities, and makes the best use of our resources. Why is it important? Well, we'll start with the duty of care that each municipality has to manage their assets. In Alberta, the MGA requires that municipalities prepare 3-year operating and 5-year capital plans. It is important to note that the outputs, data produced through asset management policies, strategies, practices, do support this duty of care and help prepare these operating and capital plans for the city. As asset management is considered an interdisciplinary practice, it gathers lots of inputs from a variety of sources and creates models or scenarios that we can use to make decisions about our infrastructure. I wanted to share this screen with council as it really highlights in a succinct form what asset management is and what it is not. On the left-hand side are common misconceptions, and on the right is what I'm going to be referring to now. Asset management is a process, continually improving, a forward-looking practice, thus strong association with sustainability that we are talking about today. A means to an end, a process that helps accomplish our goals, making decisions that have data to support them, proactively taking action to make our communities more sustainable and resilient in a holistic approach that clearly defines our service delivery to our residents. This slide has a little bit of animation, so if it's going to bother anyone, just don't look at the screen. The various disciplines shown on this slide are most often incorporated in a mature asset management program or framework. We will talk about Beaumont's journey a little later, but we wanted to highlight some key attributes of each. With the appropriate resourcing assigned, we would be in a position to develop a comprehensive program for Beaumont in the future. Many of these are standalone disciplines, but what is most important to note is in an asset management framework, they are interconnected, they support and influence each other as we manage our assets. So let's begin with the life cycle approach and what it means. Proactively managing assets through their life cycle to deliver services. For example, it is not just buying a truck and never changing the oil. It's about recognizing and planning all the life cycle costs of assets, capital costs from design through to procurement, operating and maintenance costs, something we are very familiar with, renewal and rehabilitation costs, shutdowns and incident responses we need to capture these costs as well. And finally, the decommissioning and disposal of assets. All of these phases have costs and impacts to our service delivery. We'd use inputs from demand management, recognizing projected changes within the municipality and inputting how these might impact our services we provide. Example, demographic changes, population changes, regulatory changes, and land acquisition, just to name a few. Next, defined level of service. Our framework would have the defined current level of service and ideally the optimal level of service. That is, or should be provided to the community, a sliding scale. This would also include indications of how infrastructure performance is and how it will be measured. A fourth component, cost-effective management strategies. Having plans that clearly detail doing the right things at the right time in terms of maintenance, rehabilitation, and renewal of infrastructure to minimize ongoing operating costs. Basically, being proactive versus reactive in our maintenance and operating strategies. Also, and something that is often overlooked, is finding value in underutilized resources, realizing increased value from our assets that may be repurposed or expanded to meet changing community needs. The land strategy that's going to be presented later this week to council is a great example of finding value in underutilized resources. Sustainable use of physical resources. Asset management plans would be developed to ensure services can be provided into the future in a sustainable and affordable way by prioritizing infrastructure decisions that balance costs, risks, and service delivery, and creating the necessary matrices and models with current data to help make those decisions. Risk management. This asset management component would clearly identify, describe, and define how we manage risk to ensure safe and healthy community, which would include establishing effective feedback and engagement processes to provide assurances that council's objectives are being achieved, and include risk mitigation strategies to support the continual improvement of service delivery to our residents. And finally, the one I really like, continuous improvement. Asset management is an ever-changing discipline, and all plans and documents need to be kept current and accurate to support decision-making. Relevant and ongoing review and improvement are a critical part of asset management planning. New technology, new construction materials, new ways to build. Basically, it needs to be dynamic so we can work through these models the factors in these models. All of these components on the slide would be incorporated and formalized into Beaumont's future corporate asset management. But I want to stress that administration currently completes segments of these asset management components in their delivery of services today. However, to maximize and to be more effective, having a corporate asset management strategy would strengthen our outputs with an integrated approach. Even though we do not have a formal asset management strategy developed today, we still continue to embrace our asset management mindset. Having an asset management mindset helps communities make better decisions by improving information, taking a long-term perspective, considering trade-offs, aligning decisions with community goals, and communicating why decisions were made. Making decisions in a municipal context requires thinking about trade-offs between service, risks, and costs. This slide just represents a quick snapshot of what our current elected officials have asked administration in past during budget process, for example. How do the priority projects contribute to service delivery? What are the long-term operational and maintenance costs identified on these capital projects? What level of service can we afford to provide now and in the future? With this asset management mindset or lens, our elected officials can be better prepared to deal with future challenges, both foreseen and unexpected, better able to engage with and serve their citizens in both good times and bad. So now let's just take a look at one of our forecasting models related to our fleet. The monitoring and reporting of city asset conditions, costs, risks, age, performance, and estimated useful life supports the identification and prioritization of investment needs. This ensures that with limited financial resources, the city can effectively sustain the delivery of services to residents and businesses and plan for change from factors such as growth, technology, climate, funding, etc. Keep in mind, this is only one of our feature classes. On the report card for Beaumont's fleet, the model outputs graded the condition versus performance at a C and the funding available versus need at a D, giving an overall fleet rating of a D+. The model is very simple, but it will continue to build more complex ones as we mature our asset management program. The next 5 slides break down the fleet asset registry into subclasses and provides further detail on the percentage of asset in each condition or grade A, B, C, D, and F. These graphs pull out quickly the total percentage of poor and critical assets shown in the vertical bars. Typically, these are past life, still safe to operate, but would cost too much money to rehabilitate, or are no longer required to deliver services, so need to be changed out. I'm not going to go through all the slides other than basically what you see there is a very important realization that what's a common theme with all of these, with the exception of perhaps one or two, the transit, for example, is to note that from these graphs and what has already been disclosed on the draft 10-year capital plan, is the data output supports the number of renewal requests for our fleet and equipment units rated in D or F categories. One caveat I want to just indicate on this particular slide, we use the for the protective services, we actually included the new fire engine. That's why you see that skew, just so you know, that was a little bit past the January. Transit, obviously, we only have the 3 buses and there's no other data other than we have the 3, okay? This slide outlines the projected capital investment in current year dollars for fleet and equipment assets as noted on the previous graphs. Each asset component replacement year is based on current condition of the asset and the asset's expected remaining useful life given that condition. The average annual capital investment of $812,864 represents the amount required to meet current financial obligations for replacement. The current funding level of $598,278 represents the historical 5-year budgeted average contributed from 2019 to current. We included 2023. So that's the money we've been putting in on an average basis into our reserve. As a result, the fleet and equipment annual funding gap deficit is approximately $214,000. Thus, the report card grade of a D for funding and need versus need. Simply put, we are not putting enough funds in our reserve to sustain our current fleet replacement on an annual basis. Almost done. As our CFO indicated earlier, asset management is one area of focus that administration is continuing to develop to assist in supporting decisions related to overall financial sustainability for Beaumont. So next steps, Beaumont's journey. As you can see, we have our council strategic plan that has been approved. What we're trying to do is to obtain the necessary resources to develop a corporate asset management strategy, which will align with council strategic plan and identified aspirations. On this slide, we have the full line of sight, and we can't see it on that screen, but down at the bottom. And we have next steps and updates since the strategic plan has been approved. Administration will be reviewing and providing recommendations to council to amend the existing 2018 asset management policy in the upcoming fiscal year, which is Council Policy C16. In past years, administration submitted budget requests to council for consideration to develop a corporate asset management strategy, and we'll hope to submit them again in 2024 budget requests. This is the development of the high-level long-term framework, which we talked about earlier to incorporate those 7 components mentioned. Asset management plans and asset registry. Once the corporate strategy is in place, those plans can be aligned and formalized. These plans will outline how we deliver the asset management objectives from the strategic plan all the way through. It is important to note again, administration continues to develop these plans and practices related to conditions of our infrastructure with our current asset registries. As an example, the utility master plan, which will be presented to council later this year, and more recently completed, was the conditional scores for our road network as part of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities grant council supported in 2020. Work is being done in Beaumont related to asset management. We want to enhance it to help make decisions based on data. And finally, just wanted to recap why asset management matters. Sustainable service delivery to ensure we continue to provide the quality services we rely on today and in the future. It's evidence-based decision-making. Data is provided to take the guesswork out of decision-making and setting priorities based on what needs to be fixed or replaced and when. It's cost-effective. Make cost-effective and efficient decisions proactively instead of waiting until something breaks down in frantically finding a costly fix. Our duty to fulfill our statutory responsibility to look after our community's assets. And finally, asset management integration helps identify gaps between long-term costs and available funding, contributing to the financial sustainability for Beaumont. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just back to me, another area that we wanted to touch on, if we move into the next slide, Jennifer, is priority-based budgeting. And I know this concept was introduced last year during the budget process. So just to introduce council to the concept itself, priority-based budgeting, I think is unfortunately named something that it's actually bigger than just budgeting. But it was developed by two gentlemen out of the US, probably about 12 years ago. And one gentleman was a CFO in a municipality in Colorado. And they felt there was a different way of doing budgeting. So it was intended initially to be this evolution from incremental budgeting. So just taking your last year's budget, applying an inflationary factor and saying this is what the new budget is, and everybody going about their business. They felt there was a different way to add value to the budget process and do it differently. And so they did develop priority-based budgeting, as they called it, which is involves a variety of different steps. One of the first steps, though, is identifying the programs and services that the municipality offers. And what you find across most municipalities, be it America or Canada, is a lot of the services are about the same. You get variation, but typically speaking, a municipality will provide anywhere between, I'd say, 400 to 700 services. And so when you get into those kind of numbers, you can understand the complexity that's involved in running a municipality. The next step, though, is to allocate resources to those services. And so there's a process that you go through, be it FTE, so personnel, and dollars that get attached to those services. Those services then are prioritized, so to speak, against a matrix of a variety of different criteria. The key part being, though, overall, how those programs and services align to achieving certain goals and objectives, be it they council strategic goals or objectives, or operationally. There's some things that we're mandated to do, so how well does the program align to that mandate? You then get programs and services on a spectrum, which then allow organizations to have some different conversations as it relates to programs and services. And you can start to have much more meaningful strategic conversations about allocating resources, which limited resources in most cases, how those limited resources could be realigned to achieve different strategic goals and objectives. And so much more than a budgeting tool, it becomes a tool for having specifically internal to the organization, a very different conversation about budgeting and resourcing. And it can be used in a variety of different scenarios, but very effectively to come forward to councils with a different perspective on asks that administration may identify through this process and how those asks better align to achieve certain goals and objectives. Again, be they strategic goals that council has set or operational goals that administration believes are necessary. And so this slide that we've moved to kind of talks about those various levels. You can see rationalization tools to stabilize budgets, reallocation, reallocate resources, and then fuel resources toward results of tomorrow. And then the kind of the last piece, which is a whole other dimension, is leveraging all of the community resources. So that it can allow you to get into some conversations about partnerships, be it internal to the community, other not-for-profits that can help you deliver certain programs and services, or with neighboring municipalities. And, we're seeing some of that come through, be it regional transit, some other activities that happen through the EMRB, or just having casual conversations even with neighboring municipalities about how we can use resources more effectively. So again, I think the name is unfortunate in some ways that it gets tied to budget specifically, and it's a financial focus. It is much more than that. As an organization, we have started down the path. It was introduced to the organization prior to my arrival. It was basically a finance-led project. And basically was dropped and kind of left. A bunch of data was collected and then kind of forgotten about. Last year, we did reintroduce it to the organization, and a big part of the reintroduction was just identifying programs and services. And for a lot of municipalities, that in and of itself is a big task and a great learning opportunity, because it really does get people thinking about what programs and services they do offer, and can even start asking questions of, well, why are we doing this? And it's those kinds of thinking conversations that allow us to then broaden that conversation and look at those resources in a different way and find opportunities for us to do some things differently. That was last year. We are continuing or trying to continue to evolve it into the next phase. And in that phase, it is kind of aligning the programs and services to criteria that then can demonstrate how a particular program and service allows us to achieve certain goals or objectives. It is a lot of work. In some cases, I've been involved in doing this whole process in 6 months. It failed miserably for a variety of reasons, but part of it is a lot of internal conversations and buy-in that needs to happen. It is a bit of a cultural shift. People can get a little bit nervous when you talk about reallocating resources, but it is a valuable tool that we will endeavor to continue to push forward as we go throughout the budgeting and allocating of resources processes. And we will keep council informed of where we are in that process. The tool itself has grown to the point where it is web-based, and we can allow council at points in time to look at the data. There's a ton of other information that can be gleaned from the data that gets put into the web-based tool. And it can allow us to have very different conversations with council, down to the specifics of doing scenarios. So running various scenarios around building rec centers as an example. So it can be quite effective in having our conversations as we go through budget and resource allocations going forward. I think that is the end of the presentation from administration. And at this time, we would be happy to answer any questions council may have.
Thank you, Mr. Dowler. Appreciate that. I'm sure we have a number of questions coming from council. Good information, a lot of information in the report and the attachments as well too. So with that, we'll open up the questions from members of council for Mr. Dowler and his team from finance. Councilman Cook, Kat, you have the floor first.
Thank you, Mayor. First, I have to say that I really appreciate this presentation. Very clear and well thought out approach to kind of pull all the levers available to us for long-term sustainability, which I think has kind of been a key theme in a lot of conversations we've all had. So, and I think as municipalities deal with additional pressures and responsibilities, this is definitely a timely and prudent conversation, especially from administration to bring this forward. So I appreciate that. Can you expand a little bit, Mr. Dowler, maybe on Beaumont's current situation and why we believe we're not financially sustainable for the long term, perhaps just more for the folks watching.
Mike's on, Mr. Deller.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you for the question, Councillor McCook. You know, I think fundamentally for me, if you look at some of the, I'll say, indicators around financial sustainability, a couple that really strike me as kind of cringeworthy is, you know, the question of, do we have sufficient reserves and or debt capacity to replace our infrastructure? And I think what you saw in the asset management section of the presentation was maybe not. And so I wouldn't be, administration at this point in time would not be confident, I don't feel, to answer that question in a positive. The other one that kind of stands out for me is, can we adjust our capital stock in response to changes in the rate of growth? And I think you all would be in a much better position than I would to understand the pressures that are probably facing the community right now as it relates to capital stock. If you think about programs and services and how we offer them today and the demand that might be out there in the community, I think it would be a bit of a challenge for us to actually have the appropriate capital in place to meet that demand as it exists even today. And we are still growing as a community. And so I think you have these two pressures. One, our existing infrastructure and the question of whether or not we have enough financially set aside to maintain, address that. And then on top of that, we're a fast growing community, which brings its own pressures to the forefront. So I'd say from those two aspects is really why I would lean more towards questioning our financial sustainability at this point.
Great, thank you. No, I really appreciate that response. Do we have a timeline on kind of the full implementation for the asset management strategy?
I'll let Ms. Bosso-Hudak kind of chime in here. I mean, you know, in a perfect world, it would be this year. I will say I'm amazed at what has been able to be produced for this presentation in a short amount of time. The fact that we can get to a report card kind of template, so it's easy for people to understand and see, has been amazing. So it gives me hope that we're closer than I maybe think, but I'm sure Ms. Bosso-Hudak can provide some better context.
So there's some key factors that we need to get in place. And one of them is actually so you're asking timeline. I'm going to say we at least need 2 years. And why I say that is the amount of data that we have currently and what we're missing, that's that gap. So until we have identified what we're actually missing to be able to make those models, that'll determine that. What's more important is that we actually have that strategic definition of each one of those components aligning with how we're going to move the city forward. That can be done in 1 year. And that's through engagement and that's through getting council involved. So I'm going to say a 2 year before we can have a complete kind of resolution on some feature classes at a high level. Some of them are more mature than others and we've done a lot more work, but I'd say 2 year.
Okay, perfect. That's great. Very clear. Thank you. Just a couple more questions, Mayor.
Sure, please.
In regards to the offsite levy model, can you clarify a little bit by what we mean by developers paying? I think one of the concerns I have and that I've heard is that sometimes, and I don't know if this is related or not, but the services that go in may not necessarily be prepped appropriately. And the concern is the long-term effectiveness of them and the quality of service, which will in turn potentially fall on the municipality. Would that cover some of that?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
You know, I think there's if quality is a concern, I think there's other pieces that we need to make sure are in place to be confident that that quality going in is what we need. The offsite levy model itself speaks more to making sure our partners in developing the city are paying the appropriate amounts to develop the city. and that it's not being artificially placed on the ratepayer,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
Yes, no, that clarifies it for me. Thank you very much. And then as far as priority based budgeting, I think it's definitely a great approach, and I understand why we're taking that approach. And I think it'll certainly benefit us in the long term. I think for budget, and I'm sure you probably heard this last year for budget, but if council could probably just get a list of some of the things that fell under unfunded, and maybe just a blurb as to why they were not funded. So we have a little bit of an understanding as to why this was not chosen under the priority-based budgeting umbrella. And then we're not kind of questioning or thinking, not that we're questioning administration, but just, you know, if we're thinking we need this position, but when you guys have been able to look at it holistically and put it against the priority-based budgeting, and make a different decision, it just kind of helps us get a better understanding of it. I don't know if that's possible, but it just may be beneficial.
Yeah, no, that's point taken, Councillor McCook. That's something that we can endeavor to provide that additional context for council.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And that's it. Thanks, Mayor.
Thanks, Councillor. Before we go to Councilman Newkirk, I'll just piggyback on the question that raised by Councilman McCook on the offsite levies. My understanding, Mr. Dowler, is that offsite levies currently don't include things like fire stations or rec centers in Beaumont, but I believe some municipalities are moving in that direction. I believe Stony Plain and Spruce Grove have already done this, where they're adding fire stations and rec centers to their offsite levies. Can you maybe comment on that and your thoughts on what maybe the trend in offsite levies among municipalities, please, before I go to Councilman Newkirk? Thank you.
Yeah, certainly, Mr. Mayor, you are correct. Within the legislation, there is an ability for municipalities to provide, or I guess put in place, specific offsite levies that are very specific to, as you mentioned, fire halls is kind of one that comes to mind. I believe the city of Edmonton also does one specifically on fire halls. So there is an opportunity there when we get into more specifics around offsite levies that we need to be looking at from a financial standpoint as we're growing as a city. I mean, council is well aware of some of the pressures that we have on fire services, as an example. So it is an opportunity that when we're talking about offsite levies that we need to be looking at and considering, but we also need to make sure that we have the data that will go in to support that levy. And so it's a bit of a push-pull on something specific like a fire services offsite levy.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Councilman Newkirk, followed by Councilman McCosk-Swain, followed by Councilman Barnhart. Steve, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll start by thanking Councillor McCook for her last comment. It was also something I was going to bury in my comments around, you know, the more that administration can provide us up front has, you know, creates less what if scenario talk among council, you know, second guessing, what if we did this, what if we did that? Those decisions are best made by administration, and we just need a little bit more to help understand how you got to where you got to present and suggest what you're suggesting. So thank you, Councillor McCook, for that. Regarding the capital assets deficit position put forward, I guess an observation is that the organization is getting better all the time. The asset management piece was asked for, funded and created, and now we got some report cards coming forward. So the question that I have regarding that is around even the 10-year forecast that's in front of us. So in that 10-year forecast, have we started the air quotes catch up phase? You know, we're deficit of 200 grand a year, you know, is what's put forward in the 2024 10-year forecast starting into some of the catch up?
I would say short answer, Councillor Van Newkirk, is no. Specifically as it relates to the fleet management, as of the example. So the $200,000 is actually an operating cost associated with it. So, and I will just caution that what administration would bring forward as a kind of a way to get us there is a gradual kind of from where we are today to where we need to be. It's not gonna be like, it would be a very significant shock to take us from where we are today to where we are needing to be. And so there would be, and still some further work required on getting us there. The flip side of that is from a capital standpoint, we will endeavor and have been doing this, managing on a year-by-year basis. And so this is a worst case scenario. This is something that we need to be working towards. But from an asset replacement standpoint, that's kind of our first priority. And so we will do everything that we need to do to make sure that those assets get replaced when they need to be replaced. And so as an example, from a fleet standpoint, again, if we believe that for 2024, there's $1.6 million of equipment that is scheduled to be replaced, and we only have 1.4, we evaluate those assets such that we determine actually we can drag this one out another 2 years, we will do that and knock down that 1.6 to whatever 1.4. And so there is a push-pull here again. But the 10-year capital plan would not necessarily reflect the full optimization of our asset replacements, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it kind of does. Like the example given was fleet, which is stuff that is purchased, which is part of capital. So that's why I was wondering if that stuff was starting to be reflected in some of the 10-year capital plan. That's kind of what I was pointedly asking. And I think the answer is kind of, and it'll depend on what your deeper dive looks like as you approach budget. So what I appreciate is that we've cycled out all the rusted out pickup trucks. So that's great. I've appreciated the continual ask for a mower here and a mower there and a new unit here and a new unit there. And coulda, woulda, shoulda asked for more funded, more question, more whatever, but we're at the point now where the asset management tool is guiding a little bit of this. And when you start looking at it from a priority-based budgeting look and you put the lens of service definition and service prioritization and questioning why things are there, I think it all starts coming together, but it does get a heck of a lot harder for things to be understood at a community level. So I guess my comment that I'll conclude with is, as you said, the name might be unfortunate and it might make it hard to explain. And one of the things that I read about priority-based budgeting, and I don't know if there's a comment on this, but it's hard to, you can always make changes, but it's hard to make changes because you put yourself down a path and there's a whole bunch of variables that go into a decision. And the priority-based budgeting model, because it affects or it pulls in on so much information that when you want to make a wholesale change on something, it does make it difficult. Is there any experience with that, or are we just going to figure that part out as we go, or what does that look like?
It is always a bit of a challenge when you are looking to make a change in service or service level, just to do that kind of at the flick of a switch. You know, if you think about resourcing, there could be 2 FTEs associated with providing a service that you want to exit from. Those 2 FTEs though may be 4 different people that are putting part of their time to that service. And so it's not like it's, you know, this one-to-one kind of relationship. So it does become somewhat complicated when you are looking at something like exiting a service. That being said, it at least identify areas where you want to either shift service levels or provides opportunities to look at partnerships or providing the service in a different way. So to answer your question, and I feel like I've been answering your questions in a very convoluted way, so I apologize, but it can be a little bit tricky to execute some of the things that come out of priority-based budgeting. And to your earlier question, just to flat out say it, yes, the fleet equipment replacement is reflective of what you see in the model. So on the replacement side, it is exactly what you would see in the 10-year capital plan.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Counselor. Counselor Swain, followed by Counselor Barnhart. Sam, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. And maybe just a few comments. I don't actually have any questions. Very, very thorough, both presentation and full report that came with this. The comment first up around the asset management piece and the scorecards. Yes, nice and easy to see the visuals. I'm a very simple guy, so that's helpful. I'd just be cognizant of the consistency across the departments and how you're going to manage that and how one group looks at it versus another so that we're getting consistent scorecards across. But certainly that's helpful when we go out and talk to the public. And I think a comment to Mr. Dowler there, you mentioned, what are you hearing from the public, right? Versus, the pressures from the public versus pressures from admin. The public's not coming out to us and saying, your fleet or your gators are in rough shape. You should really be investing more in some more mowers out there, right? And so that's that balance that I think that showing up there is going to be important. But all this does is, if anything, it gives us, or gives me, I should say, a lot more confidence in that there's, what we're doing here, as opposed to, someone said that we should replace this mower every 10 years. So let's do it anyway, right? Like, we're really targeting that asset management around, what is a priority? I hate to use that word, but where should we be spending that we don't have enough resources, right? And so I like how we're diving deeper into that, and to Steve's point, it's going to be tougher to explain to the public. It's not just as simple as, well, last year budget was X, let's roll it over. And so I think what council is going to need to recognize is, part of doing that deep dive is that you're going to see a lot of things that don't look very good. And we're going to need to plan for that. And, yes, it's great to build rec centers and all the nice stuff out here. But ultimately we've got to make sure we're maintaining the system. So, overall, very, very good report. I'd be curious in diving into some of those offsite levy type conversations that both of you guys brought up. But certainly appreciate it coming in, particularly at this stage of the process, and your presentation talked about where we are. And having that in July for us to kind of think through as we lead into the budget is really helpful. So just a big thank you and very comprehensive overview. Thanks.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Barnhart. Kathy, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mayor, and pardon me for putting on the headphones, but Mr. Dowler, I don't want to miss a word that you say. And the pitch of which you speak and the pitch of which I hear are not compatible without the earphones. So pardon me for that. But lots of really good information, and I think the direction that we're heading is good for the future. Unfortunately, the future never seems to come. We're always kind of chasing it a little bit, but never give up hope and keep going. A little bit on the model, the fleet management. I really like it. Scared the heck out of me when I saw it, though, and I wondered if there was is there a shock factor here, and this is what's coming in our budget. Just speak to that a little bit. Your hate to say what's your motive, but it made me think, well, now that's what we have to fix. So is that where you're headed with that?
We've got two things there. It's reality what we're working with. And until we optimize and start getting into the nitty gritty and start balancing those services with the risks and costs, we can manage models. But what's important is that this was only one feature class. And as we build and as we add all the other feature classes, we've got to look at it in that whole view. So there might be some that are great and some that are not. But it's really, this is what we have today. This is all I can give you based on what I have for facts that we've got driven. So shock factor, no, it's reality on this particular asset. So I'm going to say we got to do more work, and there's more work coming. It's just, this is what we have.
So by the time that we get to see the entire budget, will we have others that can even, I mean, that's my worry, is that this one jumps out at us and And then we maybe will be approaching that with, okay, we've got to fix our fleet. We don't want that to be in danger, but then what about the others that we might not be seeing?
We won't have it for this budget. What we're going to have are the asks to put the resources assigned to get us to that next state so that we can provide you report cards for all of the assets. So we have to get through that corporate strategic asset management planning framework. We need that in place to help with those decisions. So that's really what I'm asking for is patience and look at what we're going to put for the council during budget to help us get to that next phase. And this is only one small component of the full sustainability for Beaumont, but it has a large impact. So lots of disciplines, so we'll coordinate that. I'm hoping I'm answering.
No, that helps
Okay.
because I was thinking it was something different than that. So I appreciate that you clarified that. And I think the only other comment I wanted to make was on the priority-based budgeting. Unfortunately, my experience with that has not been good. And so I am coming into this, and I think Mr. Dowler, you and I probably went through it at the same time at the City of Edmonton. So I'm just wondering, are there other municipalities our size using this? And can you point to some successes in an Alberta context? Because I do want to believe it can work, but I haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, certainly, Councillor Barnhart. Yeah, absolutely. You know, I understand your experience. The good news is there are other municipalities in the region. So Strathcona County, Fort Saskatchewan being two that come to mind. St. Albert, I think, has dabbled in it. I haven't really, paid too much attention to what's happened there recently. But there are some success stories in the region. And so the tool itself has come a long way from what you maybe have seen in the past. I think there's, for me anyways, a lot of lessons learned out of the City of Edmonton experience. And that's part of the reason why you're not seeing this kind of, again, big bang introduction of priority-based budgeting here. We are going through this in a very methodical way, taking our time to make sure that the organization understands the tool itself before we kind of really take it on and introduce it as this whole big tool.
It's not the silver bullet. It's something
No.
that over time changes the way people think about budgeting. So
Absolutely.
I would agree with you on that. So thank you. Good work. And I appreciate all the information.
Thank you, Councillor. Appreciate that. Quick question myself. So again, great report, as everyone's already said. A lot of work into this, a lot of work. Report card idea is really very, very brilliant because it is very visual, and the average person will look at it and say, this kind of makes sense, Part of our job is to tell the public what we're doing, and tools to make easy is helpful for us. So the report card idea I really like going forward. So Mr. Dahl, I think you mentioned a comment on Steve's question about how to address the deficit in more of a gradual sense. So walk me through just an example. So on the slide, it talks about on the fleet category, deficit of 214,000. So potentially you could come to the next budget cycle or 2025 saying the 214 should be whittled away at 55 or 60,000 a year. So over 4 years, that goes away over 3 years. That's what you're referring to by a gradual reduction in the operating deficit. Is that a fair way to assess what you were saying?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I would suggest that what you've kind of just mentioned there is certainly one scenario that administration would be looking at. You can get into a little bit more analytics of this and how the reserve, you can look at your planned expenditures as it relates to the reserve. And at a point in time, if the reserve dips into a negative, then you time your increase on the contributions to make sure that you don't dip into that negative. So there can be a little bit more sophistication into bringing this in gradually. If you consider the reserve balances and the timing of some of the expenditures, but essentially what you've proposed is certainly one scenario. We would be coming forward with potentially a $30,000 increase over the next however many years to get us to the optimal overall contribution.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dahl. I appreciate that. Again, great report, and I love the report card idea. It's just very visual and very easy to walk people through. Seeing no further questions from members of council, I think we move on to the next part of our evening this evening. Oh, pardon me, sorry. We have to accept this as a report for information, first of all. So is a member of council willing to move the report to be accepted as information? Councilor McCook? Kat?
I move that the July 17th, 2023 Financial Sustainability Report be received as information.
Thank you, Councillor. Discussion on the motion from members of council? Seeing none, council, would you please vote on the motion? And that carries. Oh, Sammy. The buttons are getting weird, I think. Yeah. Oh, did you? Okay. Yeah, that carries unanimously. Thank you, council. Thank you to our presenters. And I believe we have the same presenters, and Mr. DeBlanco will be chipping in, I believe, on 3.2, overview of the 10-year capital plan overview. So just before we get started, before I think I mentioned it, we have supper break at 6:30-ish for about 20 minutes. So we'll see how the discussion is going in the presentation and when food gets here. So we'll try and coordinate that as best we can. So with that, Mr. DeBlanco, I believe you're presenting first. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Good evening to the mayor and council. I'm Curtis DeBlanco. I'm the director of finance for the city. And as requested, this evening is a report on the 10-year capital plan, that being the 2024 iteration of it. I'll ask our friends in Ledge to put some slides up on the screen for us. Thank you. So the slide on the screen shows council where we are at in terms of the budget process timeline for 2024. As we've entered phase 2 as of July 4th, which is budget development, city departments are busy putting together budget submissions for both capital and the operating budget. And that's to meet the needs of the city in 2024 and beyond. Attachment 1 shows the 10-year outlook for all capital programs and projects that have been rolled forward from the 2023 iteration of this plan. And throughout the month of June, administration has been very busy reviewing these projects and programs for reasonability within each city department. Currently, everything in this capital plan is considered unfunded. Administration, like I mentioned before, is in phase 2 and budget development, currently working on validating the accuracy of the forecast, ensuring the project listing is complete, and then, of course, prioritizing which projects will ultimately be proposed as funded in the budget for 2024, which is brought to council in November, which is phase 5. The data there within this attachment is compiled from various sources, including approved master plans, offsite levy models as it currently exists, asset replacement schedules, other documents, as well as items directed by council. The capital requirements over the next 10 years, as we just heard, are expected to be substantial, both to maintain current assets, as well as keep up with the expected growth of the city. Prioritization of capital within the city's 10-year capital plan and capital budget is inherent. The city's renewal programs are first and foremost, and they ensure that the maintenance of the city's existing assets are the highest priority. As we heard, the city contributes to each respective reserves in order to fund each of these programs. Growth projects are then prioritized after renewal and have different funding sources, namely grants and government transfers, debt funding, and everyone's favorite pay-as-you-go funding source, which I think the best example to explain is to liken it as a capital grant that the city funds from itself to itself. Also a separate category, as we mentioned before, is offsite levy funded projects, which are required as a result of new development in the city. One very, very important thing that both council and administration need to consider when contemplating new capital projects, specifically new growth projects, are the operating impacts of these new capital projects. These impacts include, but aren't limited to, new personnel in the form of FTEs, all costs relating to onboarding and training and maintaining employees within the city. Also, operating expenses for the ongoing operation of maintenance to put the asset in service. And further, as we've just heard about asset management, ensuring reserve transfers required for future renewal and replacement are in place. In the specific case of a capital project that was funded via debt, The applicable debt servicing, and that's both principal and interest expense, would be an additional operating impact. These impacts are likely to require an increase in budgeted expenditures, either from tax levy or utility rates, or perhaps some additional revenue source. And these are required to operationalize a capital project once it becomes online. To put it simply, just as the city's operating budget grows and meets demands of an increased population or additional new services, additional resources are required when new capital additions come online and become operational. Talking a bit about funding here, on the screen is specifically on pay-as-you-go, but I'll speak a little bit about funding overall. As we well know, there is a finite amount of funding sources available, which needs to be considered and forecasted when compiling a capital budget. Other considerations that must be include project eligibility for each of these individual funding sources, whether it's grant funding, things like debt limits and debt servicing limits, as well as the availability of future funding. I'll reemphasize at this time that everything in the 10-year plan included in the report is considered unfunded at this time. In terms of funding constraints administration is working with at this point, we'll look specifically at grants. The city does receive two main annual grant allocations, one from the provincial government, which is the Municipal Sustainability Initiative. City of Beaumont receives $2.1 million in 2023 on that one. And then the Canada Community Building Fund, which is from the federal government, the City of Beaumont receives $1.2 million in 2023 for that program. So per year, total $3.2 million comes to the city from these other orders of government and is annually added to the city's grant pool. The city allocates this grant pool specifically to growth projects. So just to ensure that the renewal and replacement of existing assets are funded appropriately and that we're not relying on other orders of government to make sure that we can fund those projects and programs. Looking at debt, the city is required to stay within its debt limits and debt servicing limits. These are mandated as part of the MGA. As of December 31st of last year, the city has used 56% of its debt limit and 29% of its debt servicing limit. And as I just explained, when we were talking about operating impacts of capital, any additional debt service will have an operating impact on the tax levy. And the extent of what this impact might be, should a project be funded via debt, is going to depend on things like the principal amount, the term of the loan, and the interest rate. We've talked about reserves a ton, but as mentioned earlier in the report, there is an inherent prioritization, and that's why reserves are so important. As we place the renewal and replacement of existing assets at the highest priority, the city must ensure that reserve balances and allocations are sufficient to fund its renewal programs. The city's 2023 budget includes allocations to reserves of $5.1 million. 3.8 million of that is funded from taxes, and 1.3 million of that is funded from utility rates. Best for last year, the city includes transfers of approximately 800,000 from its municipal operating budget directly to the capital budget. This is known as pay-as-you-go. As the city takes on things like developer contributed infrastructure and completes large growth projects, increased funding of this type will be required to respond to new growth and add to items like the city's fleet. As this funding source is transferred directly from the city's municipal operating budget to the capital budget, any increase to this funding source will have a tax impact. Administration delivered a report to council in March 2023, which outlined the shortfall of pay-as-you-go funding in relation to grants from other levels of government, which you see on the screen. Having a pie chart more similar to the one on the right gives the city more flexibility for funding growth projects, and also reduce the risk of any reduction in these transfers from the federal and provincial government. Similar to the question that came up in the previous report on how do we get from a funding shortfall to an ideal ratio, administration would bring forward a plan over time, which is shown on the screen right here, to move towards the chart that was on. Let's see if I can go back here. The chart on the right here, a plan that was over time, shows a path for how the city would move towards this ideal funding level, which in the March report indicated was around $2 million. In moving towards this additional funding from the city's operating budget, or an increase in annual funding from the city's operating budget would be required. With that, there's no direct financial implications from this report. Administration will take feedback and direction from council on this item and incorporate it into the proposed 2024 capital budget, which is slotted to be presented to council in November. This concludes administration's report. This time, I'll turn the floor back over to council. Thank you.
Mr. Blanco, appreciate the presentation. And council, this is an opportunity to ask specific questions of the report in front of you. We have a closed session this evening to talk about the Kenya capital plan in greater detail in a few minutes when we go into closed session. So this is more specific to the report presented in front of you now. So if I don't mind I'll have the first question if you don't mind then. Mr. Blanco, if you could, on the page you go funding shortfall slide that goes to 2031, that's indicative suggesting that if we make absolutely no changes to our pay-as-you-go model, we'll have a significant shortfall at the end of that slide. I mean, it does sound simple. Just to clarify for people who may be listening at home, if we do nothing, we'll have a very significant shortfall in our pay-as-you-go model based on the slide.
Thanks for the question. So the shortfall as it stands today, as indicated in that March report, indicated that as of today, an ideal funding level would be 2 million. So we're already at that shortfall in terms of what would be a good ratio on that pie chart for the city. This is a plan. What's on that slide with the bar graphs indicates a plan to get from where we are today more towards that ideal ratio over the course of 8 or 9 years.
Okay, I misunderstood the slide entirely when I went through it. So thank you for clarifying that. Appreciate that. With that, open to questions from members of council. Councilor Miller, Ashley, you have the floor.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for the report. I just had one question regarding the reserves and the 1.3 million from the utility rates. Can you just provide a breakdown of what the 1.3 actually is and how much is allocated from franchise fees, I guess?
Thanks for the question. So I'll answer the second part of the question first. No amount of money from franchise fees is allocated towards the utility reserves. So we have existing utility infrastructure in the ground, and to ensure that we're renewing it, replacing it on a timely basis, what we need to make sure is that the utility rates that the city charges are appropriate to pay for the existing infrastructure.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
You okay?
Mhm.
Thank you. I have Councilor Markgraf-Swain followed by Councilor Barnhart. Sam, you have the floor.
Yeah, I just had a few questions on the projects listed in the 10-year capital plan. Is this the time you want me to ask about those? Or do you want to wait till we go closer?
I think it's designed to be in closed sessions, my understanding from talking to Mr. Dalver. So questions that are specific to specific projects, preferably in the closed session.
Easy.
Do you have a follow-up to something different than that? Just the project stuff? Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Next, Councilor Warner, followed by Councilor Van Nuker. Kathy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you very much for the report. I'm really curious about the pay-as-you-go funding shortfall slide as well, but more in terms of the percentages for federal, city, and province. I'm wondering if you could just help me, and it could be that I'm thinking operating, but I recall we've looked at kind of a 30-30-30, a third, a third, a third, and this seems to have shifted, but it may be that I've never looked at it from a capital versus an operating perspective. And it just surprises me that we wouldn't want to maximize the money we get from other orders of government rather than reduce it and have more on our taxpayers. So I understand where you're going. We have more flexibility, more control. If we put our money in a savings account, we use our own money. I get that. Not a savings account, but you know what I mean? Like put it into a fund. But this particular slide, I just like the colors on it too. It's a really interesting slide. But I wonder if you could just help me understand where the 40-40-20 is coming from. Is that an industry standard? Is that something we've decided? Where's that coming from?
Thanks for the questions. It's a bit more simpler than that. The recommendation was just that pay-as-you-go be 2 million, and because the city's amount would be increased, proportionally that reduces the provincial and federal
Simple
levels.
mathematics.
Yeah. So to answer the other part of the question, the second pie chart doesn't indicate that the amount of money coming from the provincial or federal government is reduced. It's just a smaller part of the ratio.
Do you have a comment on my thought that wouldn't we want to maximize what we can get from other orders of government? Wouldn't that make sense?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. So you're not suggesting we don't take what's available if we can maintain it, but that we increase our contribution as well if we can afford to do so.
Correct.
Okay, now I understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Newkirk. Steve, you have the floor.
Yeah, no question right now. Maybe just a comment and comment around would be around the attachment one, the 10-year forecast. And just that the different versions of this that I've already seen over the years, everything shifts all the time based on priority. And so one can say we've been doing some priority-based budgeting for quite a few years, if you use those literal words. But one of the things that isn't reflected in these types of summaries or forecasts is the potential for bigger picture things to change. You know, there's potential partnerships that could be gained and cost shared amongst regional partners. There are potential grants and funding streams that may become available that aren't available today that we're not aware of. And, you know, what I do see is administration doing their best to, you know, dust off the crystal ball and make something that we have to make as per the MGA, plus being prudent with the evolving needs of the community month over month, year over year. So I think every time that these types of documents are brought forward, they're done to the best of our knowledge and to the best of our ability. And the next time we see one, it'll have changes from this based upon what we know and what we've learned. So that's where I'll leave it, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Appreciate that. I do have a question, Mr. DeBlanco. You may be able to answer it, maybe not. That's okay. But I know in your report, the MSI grant from the provincial government is 2.1 million for 2023. There's been some talk of them changing the actual formula for the MSI, jolly calling it a new program. I don't know offhand if it actually has been finalized before the recent election. To your knowledge, do you expect a different, a lower amount for 2024 from the MSI? If it stays MSI, where the new plan is going to be called? Do you have any inclination from what you may have heard or what you may be aware of?
Thanks for the question. So yes, you're correct that the program itself and the funding formula are changing within the provincial government's local government fiscal framework. I can't comment on this time, but from what I've heard so far, there's indications of the province that it should not go down, but that's at this time the best information I have.
Yeah, so on that point, I sit on the mid-sized city mayors caucus, 23 mayors and municipalities representing almost 2 million people in the province. We've been talking to the provincial government about the MSI, the current MSI program, and not reducing any further. And it has been the last couple of fiscal years. We're getting some tread with them. I'm not sure we'll make it be successful, but also EMRB has been talking about missile funding as well too. So it's a topic that is on every mayor and every council's radar. It does affect our operating when you start getting less grant money. So we are working towards hopefully getting a finalized version of the MSI or the new version of what it's going to be called in the near future to give us some financial stability in the coming years. We've been asking them to give us a model that's going to be sustainable for 3 or 4 years and give some consistent funding for projection purposes. So as I know more from my role as a mayor, I'll let council administration know as well too. Hopefully get some more positive information from Alberta municipalities, also pushing hard to get some kind of a funding model nailed down for funding. So when I know more information, I'll pass on to council administration as soon as I possibly can. It does affect us rather dramatically. So having said that, are there no further questions from members of council on the 10-year capital plan as presented? Okay, seeing none, I will ask a member of council to put forth a motion to accept the report as information. Is there a member of council willing to make that motion? Councilor Newkirk, Stephen.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll move that the July 17th, 2023 overyear of 10-year capital plan be received as information. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, members of council. Council, would you please vote on the motion before you on the screen? That carries unanimously. Thank you, council. Next on our agenda is moving into closed session. We are at 6:14. We're expecting dinner around 6:30. So I do suggest we do begin our closed session, and we'll simply have a recess around 6:30-ish for our dinner break and coming back thereafter. So with that, I'll ask a member of council to move us into closed session. Councillor Barnhart, would you be prepared to make that motion?
Yes, I will, Mayor, that council move into closed session at 6:14 PM pursuant to the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, sections 24 and 29.
Thank you, Councillor. Discussion on the motion? Seeing none. Council, would you please vote on the motion to move into closed session, pardon me. And that carries unanimously, 6-0. Thank you. We will move into closed session in a moment here and continue with our meeting in closed session. Thank you. Good evening. We are back live after our closed session, back at 8:14 in the evening on here on Monday night. And with that, we have one motion that has come out of our closed session. I'll ask a member of council to move the motion when it's on the screen in a moment here. Member of council, I can move it. Thank you. I will move that administration incorporate the following items into the 2024 proposed capital budget. Do you wish me to read them all, Ms. Winter? Or are we good? Oh, there you go. I should have asked you before. Sorry, should I read
Thank
them
you,
all?
Mayor. I could read them into the record if you prefer.
Sure, if you don't mind, that'd be fine. Thanks.
Thank you. That administration incorporate the following items into the 2024 proposed capital budget: additional benches and garbage cans along existing pathways, permanent hockey netting at the outdoor rinks, performing arts temporary facility, staging and sound at CCBCC, Range Road 241 sidewalk or trail construction around the driving range section on the south, options for building structures for shade, fitness staircase on the Church Hill, connectivity pathway on 30th Avenue, smaller basketball court options, upfit 2 rinks down at Densero and Ken Nickel, the basketball hoops like Bellevue, circuit track of fitness equipment around the community with 1 to 2 pieces of equipment per station, strategic land acquisition investment, costing of design and location of cricket pitch and netting, 3 soccer fields, leveling of Champs Valley, Densero and Milieu parks, resurfacing of existing outdoor rink surfaces at Densero and Ken Nickel for pickleball use similar to tennis court, outdoor rink structure dome and parking lot at BSRC, design of pickleball courts moved from 2025 to 2024, and strategic land acquisition.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. That well covers it. Couldn't have said it better myself. A discussion on the motion from members of council. Ms. Winter?
Sorry.
Oh, I had your hand up for something.
Oh, I had a repeat of 2. I just deleted 1.
Okay, no problem. Thanks. Discussion on the motion? Seeing none, council, please vote on the motion on the screen before you. That passes unanimously. Thank you, council. With that, that concludes our evening session on both open and closed sessions. We are adjourned at 8:16. We'll see you tomorrow night at 5 o'clock for committee of the whole. Thank you. Enjoy your